Again, thank you for the invitation, Brad and Liz. It's a pleasure to be here. Uh, Liz did a nice job about introducing me and my background and my relationship to the role and responsibilities of the Conservation District and serving as director of the Salmon Recovery Board, which you see there, and I'll talk about the board here in a minute. What you see there on your screen is the cover page to the 600-page Salmon Recovery Plan for Southeast Washington Snake River region. That plan is more than just what the cover looks like and what the contents are. It's a culmination. It's essentially a synthesis and compilation of 20 years of assessments and planning and collaboration, and work group gets together about salmon recovery, natural resource conservation, and community involvement with a strong technical foundation that represents subbasin plans. Like Brad was the watershed planning director for some time, and it's a reflection of a bunch of efforts by a lot of people over a long time to come together on a series of strategies with objectives and actions to recover salmon and steelhead in the Snake River region within Southeast Washington. It's interesting to kind of reflect back on where we were throughout the 1990s when the salmon and steelhead got listed under the Endangered Species Act across the Pacific Northwest. And for those who remember those days, that was just on the heels of the spotted owl listing on the West Coast. And people saw what that did to communities when the federal government came in and designated critical habitat and prohibited take and mandated dictates that had to be implemented. And, you know, if you look at the scope and scale of salmon across the Columbia Basin, and if that kind of outcome were to occur, it would be devastating to stakeholders, communities, and others. So we took a different approach in the state of Washington. Let me see if I can advance that to an overview of the Endangered Species Act. That act, written in 1973 and approved by Congress, requires that the federal government write a plan. It requires that specific actions be identified, that prohibitions and restrictions be acted upon, and that obligated certain entities to certain things. And that was scary to a lot of people, communities, and broader interests here in Southeast and across the Pacific Northwest. So Washington, under Governor Locke's leadership, said, we're going to do it different in Washington. We're going to develop a strategy titled Extinction is Not an Option, and we're going to empower regional organizations like the Snake River Salmon Recovery Region to develop their own strategy. Because when you develop your own strategy, the strategies are durable. There's buy-in, there's support, there's understanding. They're not surprises handed down. So I'm just proud of the work that everybody, the conservation districts, the nonprofits, the tribes, the state agencies, the federal government, all the people who've come together to be involved in the development of the Salmon Recovery Plan over the last, it's been almost 25 years now. So geographically speaking, the Southeast Washington Salmon Recovery Region is Whitman County, the portions that drain into the Snake River, all of Asotin, Garfield, Columbia, and Walla Walla counties. Walla Walla actually drains into the Columbia, but for planning purposes, they were organized with the Salmon Recovery Board here in Southeast Washington. That recovery plan, or the ESA, requires species to be delineated geographically, spatially, so that we know how many we need to have in this area, how productive they need to be, how viable, that kind of stuff. And I'll get into that in just a minute with the next couple slides here. We know that the Asotin population, which I'm going to fast forward here on the next slide, the viability it requires at least 500 adult steelhead spread over a broad geographic area. And we're going to get to that here in just a minute. It talks about productivity. You know, for those who manage any type of wildlife or animal, if the productivity is 1, that means 1 replacement for every one that you have. The growth curve is flat. And if there's any mortality, a productivity of 1 is not good. So we need to have replacement of greater than 1, and we'll get to that here in just a moment. So what our plan does is it lays out priorities. You know, we don't have enough resources to spend the amount of money we need to spend everywhere all the time. So we've got priority protection reaches where we like to do small investments, but as a way to ensure spatial diversity of the species. We've got big geographic areas where we spend large money because there's a lot of fish involved. And this next map will show what I'm talking about. So that is a map of Southeast Washington. You can see the Snake River coming. I'm assuming you can see my cursor from Idaho, where the Grand Ronde then dumps into it just north of Oregon. The Snake River proceeds northerly to Clarkston and then heads west over to Pasco, Washington, and joins the Columbia River and flows out to the ocean, as we all know. We know, and I think everybody on this call probably knows, that Whitman County lies to the north of the Snake River. So we've got Alkali Flat coming into the Snake River. If you come upstream a little bit further, you got Penowawa, and then we got Almoda, and we got Steptoe Creek. Raz is going to talk a bit about what's going on in Steptoe Creek, but what I wanted to do is orient folks to these broader polygons here. This one is generally drawn around all the water bodies that comprise the Asotan steelhead population. So it's not just Asotan Creek that makes up the Asotan population. It's Alpawa and George Creek and 10 Mile and Steptoe and Almoda. It's more than, again, just the Asotan Creek itself. Over here, you see a circle around what's known as the Toucanon population, and you can see Alkali Flat and Penowawa and Denman and all these other contributing tributaries to the Toucanon population. And I want to get into spatial structure and diversity here in a bit, but suffice to say that if we spent all of our investments on main stem Asotan Creek, Asotan population, we would be leaving behind really important water bodies like Alpawa Creek that have the capability of producing upwards of 500 steelhead. We'd be leaving behind things like Steptoe and Almoda Creek, those tributaries that drain straight into the Snake that provide great refuge for other events and isolation from large predators. Large predators can't get up in those small streams, so we see high survival in those areas. So our recovery plan really emphasizes the orange priority areas, but encourages small-scale investments, including fish passage barriers, in streams that have the intrinsic potential or known occupancy of Oncorhynchus steelhead in this particular case. There may be some questions about what I just said on that map, so maybe I'll pause Liz for just a minute here, looking at the clock. Anybody have any questions about the ESA and the population delineations and the importance of small tributaries and the notion of prioritizing large investments in the orange areas and smaller investments in the yellow? And you're welcome to drop it in the chat, but I'll just slide right on over to the next. You can open up the chat or pause me to stop anytime you like. So this is a really important component for Whitman County streams that contribute to both the Asotan, you know, I showed those two streams up there that I mentioned earlier, Steptoe and Almoda, and those streams that contribute to the Toucanon, Penowawa and Alkali. So from a planning perspective, those tributaries of Whitman County that drain into the Snake River contribute to both of those populations. We know that the delisting criteria for abundance, so the number of adults for the Asotan population is 500 adults. We know the abundance goal for the Toucanon is 1,000. So as you can see right there, there's a discrepancy. And the discrepancy is that the Asotan is considered a small population and the Toucanon is an intermediate. Large populations are those like in the John Day or Deschutes or really big water bodies. So we've got our goal. We know how many adults we need. We know that we want them to occupy nearly all the historic range, and that's to hedge our bets against catastrophic failures, wildfire, drought, whatever it may be. We want them to have a presence in all of the historic range, including Steptoe and those I showed on the map, which explains why we spend some money in those areas. There's the productivity notion. If we always had one adult coming back for one adult and somebody caught that one adult or it died for some other reason, our productivity falls below one, and that's a downward growth population trend, and that's not good. And then lastly, to achieve delisting, we not only need to have a bunch of fish, we need them to be everywhere distributed, we need a productivity that's positive. We also are required to ensure we have life history diversity. Steelhead are really cool. They spawn in the spring. Typically on that lower right, that's probably a 2-year-old fish. So it lived in some tributary, maybe a salt creek for 2 years. And it decided to go to the ocean where it lived for 2 years and will come back to spawn in the spring. The fish on the left there is much larger. It might be closer to a foot. It may have come from a Salton Creek too. It may actually be the sibling to the fish on the right, but for whatever reason, both have the same parents. They both live in the same water body. The one on the left decided not to go to the ocean, but rather to residualize and become a resident. They're the same genetic fish. They're both called Oncorhynchus micus. One was resident and one is anadromous. So we need to allow fish to express multiple life histories, because what if there was a catastrophic event in the ocean and every one of our steelhead were out in the ocean? Be nice to have that guy living here, back here in Almota Creek or Upper Charlie or wherever, to hedge our bets against those kind of catastrophic failures. So the notion here on my last slide here is simply that small streams contribute to spatial structure. That's hedging our bets against catastrophic failures in other watersheds, and provide for life history diversity. A fish doesn't have to go to the ocean if the little creek has got water year round. A little fish in a creek like that's probably not at risk for predation by a smallmouth bass or some other predator, because the water body is too small. So the productivity is pretty high, or can be pretty high. We just got to make sure the fish can get there by removing fish passage barriers and doing some minor restoration, like is recommended in the federal government stock status review, where they review every 5 years the status of our stocks, the work that's been going on in our region, and recommend things. And well, coincidentally, they recommended that we improve access, i.e. fish passage, to historical rearing habitat. So it should be no surprise that we do fish passage barrier projects, and Brad's probably going to talk about some of that. They suggest that we restore the lower elevation productive habitats. So no surprise, we're doing small scale, inexpensive in-stream habitat restoration in smaller water bodies. Throughout the region, they want us to reconnect floodplains, because reconnected floodplains reduce temperature, hedge against or buffer floods. They ensure water availability longer because that water is stored in the landscape, and it improves water quality. So those are no surprises to us. And then again, I've already covered this one, but the last one they recommend is we continue these low-tech process-based methods to jumpstart channel reconfiguration and rehabilitation by reconnecting floodplains using low-cost strategies. And I think that that's the last one of my slides. And I look at the clock, it looks like we have plenty of time. I'd be happy to answer or respond to questions or comments, or hand it over to Brad and we can take questions and comments at the end. So thank you.
If that's your last one, Steve, stop sharing.
Okay.
All right. Well, thanks, Steve. And Steve kind of touched on those streams in Whitman County. And during his talk, he was talking about salmon and steelhead. And we're going to focus on steelhead. And Steve did a really good job of talking about resident trout or steelhead. And the only difference is an anadromous fish goes to the ocean. So see here if things are going to work for me. Yep. So Steve mentioned, I'm going to talk about Steptoe Creek. Steve pointed it out in the larger picture. You can see with my cursor down here on the very right-hand corner of the map is Clarkston, Washington, Lewiston, Idaho, 6-7 miles up the Snake. It's a real small watershed with a little bit of survey work done by Fish and Wildlife in 2000, 2001 that I'll get to later, but we really don't know a whole lot about steelhead use in this system, but we worked with the Salmon Recovery Board and put in some applications, and I'll get to pictures later, but we've done 2 culvert to bridge projects that were passage barriers. And so why are we doing protection in a restoration reach? Steve kind of stole my thunder. It's kind of, he's in Walla Walla, I'm in Pullman. There was these surveys that were completed by Fish and Wildlife in the early 2000s, showed that there was decent habitat there, but there was some blockage. Steptoe has very low flows, but it never goes dry. One of the interesting facts that we found out recently, the Palouse Conservation District has an awesome research and monitoring program, and they started doing some flow and temperatures down on Steptoe. We're running about a CFS in the summertime, not a lot of water, but it doesn't go dry, and it's cool. 62 for steelhead in southeastern Washington. That's not an ice box, but it's not a heat sink either. So some really neat information came out of there. As I've mentioned a couple of times, and Steve talked about it, there were two complete barriers. One was a adult barrier, the lower one that I'll show you. Then the upper barrier was a complete barrier for juveniles with a gradient of 7%, which would have allowed adults to pass, but up until 2018, that lower barrier blocked them a mile downstream, which will show you some maps where they were at here in a couple of slides. One of the interesting things we did with a grant from the Washington State Conservation Commission, I've got to talk about partnerships here for a minute. We are so blessed in southeastern Washington to have the Snake River Salmon Recovery Board. We work with Nez Perce Tribe has seeded and grounds within Whitman and southeastern Washington. And then we also work a lot with the Umatilla tribes, and those professionals from those tribes just have a lot of information. Then we've got the state agencies, we've got the Forest Service that's donate some of the trees that we've used. And our Washington State Conservation Commission last year had some funding for us to do some eDNA sampling to assess whether or not there's trout in these streams. They can't tell us whether that fish is an adremis or resident, but more than likely, if you've got resident, there's the ability for them to be an adremis. And the last one is what Steve talked about, very cost-effective projects. When I show you these projects, we worked with Whitman County's road department on the bridges, and these budgets are shoestring budgets. I knew to be competitive, we had to be low cost. It was less than 160,000 to get 230 post-assisted log structures, and that's getting the material from the U.S. Forest Service, getting it on site, and then hand placing these structures. So we really kind of found out when Steve and I talked last week and this week that he's like, you hit everything that NOAA Fisheries listed in their call for us to do in southeastern Washington. So this map shows, again, you see the watershed. This lower arrow points to the first culvert to bridge, which was a complete barrier. You'll see that in the picture. We completed that in 2018, and then 2020 and 21, we put the 135 structures in this red box. And then this last year, the step-toe culvert to bridge was just replaced within the month, and the 95 pals were placed late July, early August. So, this is Stewart Canyon right here, and those studies in 2001 and to 2003, they found some cool water refugia up here, and it's really important to get these barriers out and get access into Stewart Canyon where there's cooler water, which the juveniles need for overwintering. The water's a little bit warmer in the winter and a little bit cooler in the summer in these spring-fed systems. And it kind of, people think, wow, warmer in the winter. Well, those springs, those upwellings help with that water not being too cold. Hopefully you don't get anchor ice, which forms at the bottom of the stream and freezes from the bottom up, which will kill everything. So there's some pretty neat features going on in Steptoe Creek, even though it has low stream flows in the summertime. So I'm going to get into the two culvert to bridge projects. Not a great picture here, I apologize, but this is the outlet. You can see there's a big drop between the water and the culverts, so that was identified as a barrier. Didn't have a better picture than this, I apologize, but that's what it looks like now. That culvert was L-shaped and failing, put in the 60s, late 60s, early 70s by the Army Corps, and we got a new bridge in here for under $250,000. So the next culvert is upstream a mile, and that was done just this late fall. This is looking downstream, and this is the downstream look now. This is the aerial shot. I got up high on the hill looking downstream, and another downstream shot. So the first pictures were somewhere around this area here looking downstream. Now this is looking back upstream, And that's a 7% grade going through that culvert. And there again is the upstream view close up. And then we've got a couple of, this is just looking upstream again from a little further out, and you're going to get a shot of some of the pal structures that we put in here on the lower section of the bridge. We stopped not knowing how far the county was going to need to work either upstream or downstream. But trying to think if there's anything else to be said about that. This the lower bridge opened up a mile, or lower, yeah, the lower bridge opened up a mile to this culvert that was replaced this fall, and we estimate about 4 miles of habitat was opened once this bridge was installed here. So now, kind of taking a step back for just a second, Steve talked about habitat assessments, and a lot of the systems in southeastern Washington have had unbelievable habitat surveys that just cost, a lot of money, and there's a lot of great information that come out of them. Well, again, the Washington State Conservation Commission had some funding. I talked about the eDNA sampling, but in conjunction with that, we did habitat assessment on 4 streams, and I just have some pictures in here from Steptoe to kind of show you before we get into the pals what some of the habitat looks like within Steptoe. We were looking at shade, we were looking at in-stream habitat for fish, and there's great alder components through here. Those are white alders, decent shading for the stream, but not a lot of habitat for fish. And when these alder trees die or blow over, they're actually, most of them are rotting from the inside out. They've had so much water, they don't have to work real hard for water. They get really big, and then they start to decay from the inside out. So when they hit the ground, there's really not a lot of habitat forming possibilities from this white alder. So the next picture here, we got a red arrow that kind of shows a pool habitat. There's a little bit of structure here for fish, but again, it's just not great habitat for juvenile or adult steelhead in quite a few of the reaches. We did document some good habitat, but it was lacking in Steptoe. And here is an area where there's very little vegetation, maybe a little habitat below these rocks. And then some of these rocks in the stream, there's going to be little pocket water, but you don't have a lot of areas for a large number of fish because juveniles don't like to see each other. They like to get out of each other's way and get up underneath pieces of wood. So again, I stated in 2020, 21, between those 2 years, in the lower reach above the first bridge, we put in 135 structures. And then this last late summer, early fall, we put in 95. So I'll show you a few pictures of these pals. These schematics were developed by a group out of Utah State. Anna Branch Solutions is kind of a company that came out of that. But these are hand-placed structures. We get the wood from the forest, so they're conifer trees. And we have bank attached, mid-channel, and channel spanning. And these little drawings in here kind of show areas where you get kind of these back eddies or eddies where fish can get out of flowing water. That last picture I showed, let me go back to this picture right here. If you're a fish, it's like a treadmill for them. They have some small areas that they can get out of, but they're basically swimming all day long. When you put a pal structure in, you make areas for that fish to be able to save some energy, get in around these pieces of wood or get into a pool and kind of rest. And the more important feature of like these wood structures, any one of them, whether it's channel spanning or this mid channel, for a second here, I'm going to jump ahead. We've got bank attached. It gives spaces for fish to get away from predators, but to also rest. And where if you didn't have this structure here, you might have 2 or 3 fish in this area. With this structure, you can have 10 or 15 because they can get out of each other's way. They don't see each other. So these structures are meant to slow the water, pull the water, back up water. And like Steve mentioned, one thing we're seeing, and I'll show you in pictures, is we're getting some hyporheic connection. And hopefully over time with those stream flow gauges lower down in the watershed below where we're putting these structures in, someday hopefully possibly seeing increased summer base flows. So there's a possibility of that. So here's the installation of pals. This wood was brought in, set. Right back here, you can see two posts that were driven in, and we try to get them so they kind of come across each other so the material doesn't float out when the structure is completed. Try to get it held in place. So if you can see here, these guys are holding on to a pneumatic post driver. This driver's 80 pounds, and it's got hydraulic hoses to it to a generator, and vegetable oil is used to power the pack so that if we have a leak, we're not leaking hydraulic fluid into the stream. These structures go in pretty quick. You got a couple more people that are up by the generator. So what's interesting in this picture, the landowner was with us every day while we installed all 135 structures. And I was talking with Steve. We've both been doing this since 98. And we've had landowners come out and watch and come out and have interest. But this landowner was there for all 135 structures that were installed. So we're getting buy-in. He brought his sons out and showed it. Liz, I think we've got a video on our website, don't we, about Steptoe Creek, and the landowner talks on that video. Here again, and I really want you to take a look at this picture. This is prior to installing pals, and you can almost jump across the creek here. There's really great shade through this section. There's some rocks and some habitat, but look at what we created just after 1 year with pals in this section. We've got an upstream pool. We've got a place for juveniles when they come back into this system to use these areas and go into these pools and find food, get out into the riffle, get some exercise, but they got areas where they can rest. And more importantly, when the flows come up, it's not just a continuous treadmill through here. If you look back, this water was flowing continuously with a few rocks during a high flow event, and then maybe get behind these trees or maybe get up in here. But we put some structure into the stream that will allow these juveniles, when the flows are higher, to kind of have some protection. And this next picture shows, this is some structures placed up here. In visiting with the landowner, he has occasionally seen water come out here. These structures were put in 2000, and there's been continuous water out here. And this isn't a big area, but on Steptoe, it's an incised canyon. There's a lot of floodplain connection right there in comparison to what's available to the fish. So this area is acting like a sponge. It's soaking up water. It's giving an area for juveniles to get into areas outside of flowing water, find some food, and then get back into the stream channel. So these are really important in it. And again, in some instances, private landowners aren't willing to give that up. And Steve can correct me if I'm wrong, and maybe during questions we can talk a little bit more about this. We're seeing more floodplain connection projects in the Snake River region over the last 5 years than we did in the first 20 years, because landowners are starting to see the benefits of that and the impacts of flooding in a big river system like the Tucannon or a Soden Creek to get that floodplain connection in the Walla Walla. It really lessens the impacts downstream. And so this is this last year. And again, if you can remember, the stream was, this is 6 to 8 feet wide when we had 2 to 3 feet of water before we put these structures in. We've really got a lot of pooling effect. We're going to see green up of these areas off to the side by a year from now. It's going to be greener along the stream. We got some pretty high densities in here. This is hard to see with the picture, but this is the stream channel down here. There's a floodplain here. We're right next to the county road, so we're really not wanting it to come this way. But over here, we have some areas within 5 years or more, we could possibly get water out on these sections, which would really slow it down. and hopefully increase summer base flows. So just some more pictures. This one here showing how much water's down there, where the water was basically right in this section. We've actually got it all the way over to where the floodplain starts going up over here. And this section was 12 or 15 feet wide. And it's just from putting in pals that go about 85 to 90% across the available channel, and it backing up water immediately. And I don't know, I'm going to go back here. There's a lot of mint in here because this is not far from Steptoe. And that mint actually helped us in backing up that water. It was really neat. When we went out there and looked, it was just amazing how the whole, other than where we had flowing water, there was mint growing, and now the mint is helping to kind of not seal up those structures, but slow that water from going underneath of them. So we've mentioned the eDNA sampling on the second slide or third slide, I believe. We got that funding from the commission. And this basically is taking water samples and sent off to a lab. I think it's a U.S. Forest Service lab, and do analysis for trout DNA. The fish in the system shed DNA, and these water samples pick it up and sent off to a lab, and they can tell us what's in a stream. And we were looking for trout or steelhead. So as Steve mentioned, Clarkston's down here to the right. So we've got Steptoe. We did Steptoe Creek, and we did Stewart Canyon, which was above a barrier that hadn't been taken out prior to this sampling. And then we did a spring sampling in Wawawi Creek. Elmota, we did 2 samples, both spring and fall. Petawawa, and then Alkali Flat. The analysis was pretty interesting. All streams that we sampled had detections for trout, but the Steptoe 2, which was on Stewart Canyon above a complete barrier for juveniles, had no detections on it. And then we didn't do it in Wawawi in the fall, and then in Petawawa in the upper section of Petawawa in the fall, we didn't have a detection, but we had one in the spring. So pretty exciting to see where there are trout within these systems within Whitman County. And it's just going to help drive future restoration efforts that with landowners who are interested in doing steelhead restoration in any of those systems in Whitman County. I think that was my last slide, Liz, and I don't know if we got any questions in the chat or whatever, but Steve and I are both available for questions on the implementation of culverts to bridges or PALs or salmon recovery in the Snake River region. I really appreciate everyone joining us tonight. I hope you learned some things, and so that's what I've got, Liz.
Awesome. Thank you both. Yeah, we have a few questions to run through. As a reminder, if you have any questions, feel free to put them into the chat. You're also more than welcome to just unmute yourself and ask them, whatever you prefer. But we'll start off with a question that we got with registration that I really think is a fantastic question. What kind of cultural restoration can happen? So what can we do to involve the community in steelhead restoration that has a potential to change hearts and minds? So maybe Steve, if you want to kick us off.
Yeah, that's quite a sophisticated question. It might take a while, it might take both of us to kind of hit that one. But my initial reaction to the question about changing cultures to support and be advocates for steelhead recovery or any natural resource interest, whether your interest be burrowing owls or spotted frog or some kind of an avian interest. The culture really evolves around developing common understanding of the benefits of conserving that particular species. In this particular case, we're talking about steelhead. So even if you're not a steelhead fisherman or don't really even care about steelhead, Brad touched on all these things. What we see as a result of steelhead habitat restoration goes way beyond the fish. you could see how frogs and amphibians would like that restored floodplain that Brad showed, much greener after the Palouse. Downstream landowners love the fact that water is getting stored on the landscape and is available later in the irrigation season. So if you're an irrigator, conservation on behalf of Steelhead is benefiting water availability. If you like to swim in the water quality is better. So to develop a culture that embraces conservation, if we can develop common understandings of the benefits beyond the fish or the bird or the owl, then I think we begin to engender that notion of a rising tide floats all boats. In this particular case, what we're seeing, like Brad mentioned, is flood risk reduction by reconnected floodplains. So if you're a downstream municipality, restoring upstream watershed conditions is good for fish, but also good for community. We've talked about the Green River watershed over on the west side, and that particular watershed has an upper watershed that provides the municipal drinking water for one of the large cities over there. And we've heard talks about what it would cost to build a capital facility that provides clean water for a city that size would be staggering. The Mill Creek watershed that lies right here behind the community college's upper watershed is protected, and its water is provided to the city of Walla Walla for municipal water supply. So conserving and protecting salmon habitat up there is good for fish, but it's also very good for water quality for the city of Walla Walla. So, I'll wrap it up and hand it over to Brad, but I think if people aren't interested in the conservation species of interest, they need to understand the collateral benefits of doing what this work like Brad is talking about here. So that's my reaction, Elizabeth.
Yeah, I think in a lot of things in the southeastern Washington have already been done, and it's not that they've all been implemented or done, everything's out on the table yet, but there was model watershed plans in southeastern Washington and Asotin, Garfield, Columbia counties, and then we had sub-basin plans, and then we had water resource inventory area plans. And the neatest thing about those that I didn't touch on with partnerships is a lot of local watershed landowners or water users or citizens were part of those groups, just as well as the Snake River Salmon Recovery Board. Steve touched on it, that it touches 5 different counties, and the county commissioners from each one of those counties sit on Steve's board with 2 citizen reps. So there's a lot of things going on to get engaged in and continue to be engaged in. And in the state of Washington, we've got the voluntary stewardship program, which is probably a little more focused. It touches on fish and wildlife habitat and frequently flooded areas, the 5 critical areas. So there's a lot going on right now. It's just getting in tune with your counties or your conservation districts or the Salmon Recovery Board. And Liz, I think you had, I defer to you to talk about the Orca Recovery Day and some of the other things that the Conservation District does up in Pullman to get locals involved, if you wouldn't mind. I'd butcher it too much.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Planting projects, right? Palouse CD has planting projects going on pretty constantly in the spring and the fall, and everything that we do upstream improves salmon habitat downstream, right? So if you're interested, March and April, we will have plenty of events that you can join in on, learn more about water quality, aquatic habitats, things of that nature. So yeah, thanks, Brad, for mentioning that. So could you, maybe Brad, you could kick us off. Where does most of the funding come from for the restoration efforts, and do the various agencies work well together?
Well, they work really well together in our region. We're recognized for that, and Steve started it off with the Snake River Salmon Recovery Board. John Foltz continued it, and now we're lucky to have Steve back. The work is really good. The landowners, I'll say, I think I kind of touched on it with the floodplain connection projects in the last 5 years or so. Maybe it's only been 4, maybe it's been 6, I don't know, where we've done floodplain restoration projects. But I really believe landowners are seeing the benefits of what can go on out there. So when Steve talked about it in the 90s, when Steelhead were listed, and I started working in 96, there was a liability to have land associated with salmon or steelhead. And we turned that liability into an asset because of the funding. I'm going to talk about some funding sources we haven't dove into, but they happen within the region, and that's Bonneville Power Administration. And Steve can probably talk more to that, but I worked a lot with Bonneville Power Administration and BPA funding in the early 90s up till about 2006. Within Whitman County, where we're talking, it's either the Washington State Conservation Commission, the Salmon Recovery Funding Board. Steve, what do we get? About $1.2 million to $1.5 million a year to put towards projects. He's shaking his head. Highly competitive, and we're protection reaches, so we've really got to sharpen our pencils within Whitman County to come up with cost-effective projects that maybe slide in because they're so cost-effective. They're not going to score out as well in our ranking system. But then I also want to touch on Department of Fish and Wildlife has got some funding coming up. NRCS has funding. We actually teamed with the PALS, the Post-Assisted Log Structures, and Steptoe with NRCS funding. And then there's ecology funding also. So there's actually a lot of different funding sources and a lot of different people that a lot of different agencies that want to get to be a part of this because they see it successful. There's a lot of pushback in the late 90s, early 2000s that voluntary restoration couldn't happen. And Steve, I think they could come down here and show that it does work and that it does restore habitat. And Steve mentioned out of basin impacts. We are totally 100% restoration funding for salmon and steelhead in southeastern Washington. Our money doesn't go to hatcheries, it doesn't go to harvest or hydro. We focus on habitat and really working hard to improve habitat for steelhead, or some watersheds have 4 different species. Steptoe has 1, steelhead. So Steve, did I leave anything off there on the funding side of things?
Yeah, thanks, Brad. And that was a good overview. A couple adds to that. Bill Ruckelshaus and Congressman Norm Dix, created or oversaw the development of the Pacific Coastal Salmon Recovery Fund, which is a federal account. So 85% roughly of the salmon recovery dollars that come into various programs is federal. So the majority is federal because the ESA is a federal law. And also because of the treaty trust obligations. When the government signed those treaties in 1855, it ensured the ability to hunt fish in traditional places. So we've got treaty trust obligations to meet. We've got commercial fishing industries out in the Pacific that depend upon healthy salmon runs. So whether it be treaty tribal obligations, trust obligations, or economic engines, or just healthy watersheds in general, there's a very strong national interest and support for what we're doing across the Pacific Northwest. And I want to talk about the Bonneville Power Administration, who's obligated to mitigate the impacts of the hydropower system that Brad mentioned. Brings a lot of money into the region for habitat restoration. And then can't not mention the state legislature. The state legislature has really embraced this notion of watershed-based, community-led restoration, non-regulatory, and they've created the Fish Passage Barrier Removal Board that's in response to the culvert injunction on the west side, but with great leadership and intelligence, they made that a statewide account. So we've got statewide money to address fish passage barriers with that program. The Salmon Recovery Funding Board emerged as a result of that PACSERF dollars and is supported with state legislative dollars as well. This year, we've got 2 new accounts. The riparian program, which is brand new, which is $25 million for the state. We've got a large cap targeted investment program, which is brand new, supported by the legislature. That's, I think, around the $25 million allocation as well statewide. We've got the state supporting fish in, fish out. So we need to monitor the status and trends of these fish so that we can track the delisting criteria that I mentioned earlier. We've got Brad mentioned this, ecology with legislative funding. So thanks to the state legislature, floodplains by design, which funds large-scale floodplain restoration projects in support of water quality, water quantity, and salmon that are community-based and locally supported. So the list of state and federal resources that are being committed to what we're all talking about here is overwhelmingly supportive and very encouraging. So I'm long-winded to that response list, but there's my end of the.
Awesome. Thank you both for your,
Well, and Steve, I would say that the agencies have come a long ways and really support. One of the National Marine Fisheries Service is a real huge proponent, has a lot of support for doing projects in these small systems. And it doesn't come as any surprise because they said that those small systems, we need to have different populations or different areas for survival. So it's really since 1998 or 2002 when we wrote the plan, Steve, we had good partnerships back there, but I think they've all just evolved and have just blossomed.
Awesome.
Yeah, to Brad's point, it was scary back in the 90s with all these listings and the notion of sacred cow, and no one had wanted them discovered in their backyard. And to now fast forward to today, just great stuff's going on. So yeah, I share that.
Cool, thank you. We received a question. You mentioned partnerships and the importance of partnerships in this. Could you be more specific with who the partners are and what their interests are?
Well, I can give it a shot, Brad. Brad's been in the implementation partnership role for his career primarily, but the Salmon Recovery Board, as Brad mentioned, is a legislative or policy direction comprised of 2 citizens and 1 county commissioner from each of the 5 counties, and the Umatilla tribe with support from the Nez Perce. But they are based upon all these partnership groups. Lead entity group, the nonprofit Tri-State Steelheaders, for example, the watershed groups, the conservation districts, clearly, the tribes and others, and I'm sure I'm missing a whole handful, but the strength is in the number of partners here, because when we can all speak with the same voice, the message becomes very compelling and powerful. And so I think after 25 years of collaborating and successfully implementing the Salmon Recovery Plan, that's the power that Brad talks about. He does such a good job. I should have just let him take it away.
No, that's right, Steve. And so those projects, we'll start with the bridge projects first. There's a partnership between the district. So the partnership is between the Snake River Salmon Recovery Board and the Recreation and Conservation Office, where the money comes from. Then we worked with the landowner who said, yeah, I'm totally fine with the county taking out the bridge. So that right there, we had, 4 partners. You go to the Palouse projects, you've got the same that you had other than the county road department. Then you put in either the U.S. Forest Service or a landowner up in the forest. We've gotten some from private landowners to bring those I was going to say noxious trees, the conifer trees down. And then you've got, we get equipment from Fish and Wildlife. We get equipment from Fish and Wildlife. Gosh, I had we've got a story map that's here that you can click on, and I see it was also in the comments. I'm losing a couple of partnerships that we've got, but our district works with, hires a crew to come out and do the work. So each one of those projects has at least a handful of partners that are, really valuable to the project. And one question I get is, why does the U.S. Forest Service donate trees for steptoe? Well, that goes right back to Steve's slide that had the big circle for the Asotan population. The U.S. Forest owns a ton of acres in the headwaters of the Asotan, the Toucan, and so donating trees to Steptoe Creek, which doesn't have any U.S. Forest Service land, benefits that steelhead population at some point down the road. So we've got partnerships all over. And to me, the biggest one that's really helped is having the county commissioners sit on the board, because in previous projects up Asotan Creek, I worked with the county road department, and I worked with the county road department here. They have equipment and abilities that are outside of our control or outside of what districts have. And typically they help us because the road infrastructure could be protected by projects or different things. So they'll haul rocks for us, haul trees for us, and do other things. So it's just getting to know our county commissioners, I think has benefited the Snake River region and Whitman County or the Palouse Conservation District in a big way.
Excellent. Yeah, speaking of tree donations, some of you on the call may have donated your Christmas tree to us. We did Christmas tree pickups this weekend with the Boy Scouts, and those trees will be going into in-stream restoration structures. So another example of how the partnerships can really create some difference in these projects.
Here's a real good one, and we've got Melissa on the line with WDF&W. We did that eDNA sampling through the commission, and the next round of funding, that is not going to be eligible through the commission, and I'm disappointed, and I don't know the exact reason why, but Melissa found out about that. So WDF&W has some money for us to come down and replicate that study again this spring. So that partnership wouldn't have happened without Melissa hearing that, we weren't able to get money. They have some money. So we're collecting this information. And so instead of just having one year's worth of information, we'll hopefully have two. So it's kind of snowballs. It really does. And everybody's in it on a voluntary basis, trying not to mandate. You've got the Endangered Species Act, but the landowners on Steptoe Creek, and I tell this to the funding agencies and the permitting agencies, for this landowner to do those Palouse projects, it doesn't benefit him. He can't take his boys out there fishing if we ever get a population in there. Steptoe Creek is closed to fishing. So what can we do to help the species, but also have a real, not a huge economic impact on the landowner as well?
Cool, thank you. Another question we received, can you talk about other species of fish that benefit from PALs and these other restoration activities in the Snake River Basin?
Yeah, so in Steptoe, you'll find dace and other species of fish, and they're just like steelhead, where when a flood comes up, they need refugia. They need an area to get out of the fast-moving water. So dace, sculpin, that's all I've seen some steelhead in Steptoe in the structures the second year. So we did it in 20 and 21. I saw some juvenile steelhead, but other than dace and sculpin, I don't know if I've seen anything else. Steve, if there's any species that's in there using that habitat, is going to benefit from that enhancement of structures that are put in there. The wood cover is going to protect them from predators, going to give them a place to rest. So it's basically more usable habitat. When you saw those pictures with the narrow stream channel, treadmill kind of looking, no areas for them to get out of the flow, you add a little bit of roughness, you spread that water out, you give them more area for food, potentially for just slower velocities. Am I missing anything, Steve?
Yeah, a couple that come to mind are the Pacific lamprey and freshwater mussels are benefit from cleaner, colder water, and those are very culturally important to our tribal partners. Brad covered all the traditional in-stream aquatic organisms, but the benthic community diversity increases exponentially. This all feeds salmon, which then feeds orca and feed people. And so the food chain lift from restoring habitat in stream is way beyond steelhead. So if you like lamprey or freshwater mussel or seeing orca, it all matters.
Yeah, and I see their crayfish are in there, and crayfish are important because they provide food. So yeah, I think everything benefits from it. The problem that we have is there's not a lot of monitoring money. Claire, could you please put Asotin Creek intensively monitored watershed? All these structures, if you look up the Asotin Creek intensively monitored watershed, all these things are being monitored at a high level. I mean, just major surveys, pre and post, and then post surveys, and they're doing fish density surveys. Steve, do you remember the increase in juvenile production that they have in Asotin Creek? Is it 25% or?
Yeah, they reported as 127% of current, which would be a 27% increase. And they saw in streams where they did much more aggressive restoration, over 200% increase, like Bridge Creek down on the John Day. So the more aggressive the restoration, the more floodplain connected. Brad touched about all the ecological functions of floodplains. The fish grow better and survive better. Yeah,
so Bridge Creek IMW intensively monitored watershed, Asotin Creek IMW, Idaho Fish and Game has one on the Potlatch River. And they're doing a lot of these same structures. The only difference between those and what I'm doing is they're doing beaver dam analog structures, which Steve says are just bigger structures. Nervous in Steptoe to put beaver dams in with 1 CFS of water. So hoping these structures will kind of build up over time and help out. But then I see a question from Ronnie. Great question, Ronnie, on Elmota, Pinawawa, and Wawawi. The species in those streams would be similar to Steptoe with trout or steelhead. Steve, was it Pinawawa where they ran a trap for a while?
Right, it was. Yeah, I collected adult steelhead. Yeah.
And so Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife has run a trap there. The plans for restoration in those systems are ongoing. It's just hard to get that money. We've started in Steptoe. We hope to move into those areas. Elmota Ronnie, is covered by the Whitman County Conservation District. At the beginning of the presentation, Liz mentioned that there's 4 districts within Whitman County. Our district ends just on kind of what I would call the southern edge of that watershed. So we would go after funding for Wawawi or Steptoe, and then Whitman CD would go after funding for the others. And I know the one you didn't mention is Alkali Flat Creek. There's some stream restoration going in Alkali Flat, both with riparian plantings and post-assisted log structures of that nature. So yes, there are plans. There hasn't been any proposals written for those watersheds yet, but there definitely is plans.
Awesome. All right, we have one final question for you. What can we do? Someone wrote in, they said, my farm has a county culvert at the downstream end of my property. Is there anything I can do to make it less of a barrier?
That's a great question.
Good,
Did you have something, Steve?
Well, my suggestion was to reach out to Melissa or one of the Department of Fish and Wildlife habitat bios and have them come out and take a look and give us some recommendation. And if it's a critical salmon barrier, we can use salmon recovery dollars depending upon the situation. But yeah, you have someone from Fish and Wildlife come give an assessment and recommendation. Cool, good question. Brad, what's your response?
Yeah, I think that's exactly what they need to do is contact WDF&W or the Conservation District and go take a look at it. You know, a landowner being able to do anything for that culvert, I would really want to have somebody to design something up so you're not having an unintended consequence. And it doesn't say what we would design up either, wouldn't, but definitely get some professionals out there to take a look at it, like Steve mentioned, and Melissa's on the line here. I don't know if the person that asked the question is online or not, but we can put, Melissa, if you wouldn't mind putting your contact information in the chat. I see you said you'd be happy to help, so.
Yeah, I'll throw my contact information in there, and yeah, whoever, they can either reach out to me directly, or I know sometimes landowners prefer to work with the conservation district first, and it can be kind of helpful when it's the permitting can be intimidating. So I totally get that as someone who works with people on permitting. So I'm happy to either way, if they want to work with you, Brad, you guys, and you guys work with me, or vice versa, I'm happy to do it. But I'll throw my my email address and my phone number in there too.
Thanks, Melissa. Yeah, I don't know whether that is in Whitman CDs or if it's in, what part of the county it's in. So whatever CD area it's in, if they want to work with a CD. And I really appreciate Jennifer. Jennifer pointed out that the first funded project in Whitman County was on Pinawawa Creek. And Steve, do you remember the year that was on Pinawawa? Was that been 15, 16? Sometime maybe? It was on core ground.
It was on core
in Lower
ground,
Pinawawa.
and it was post-assisted log structures, as I recall.
Correct.
Yeah, there were some false indigo eradication, as I recall. But yeah, it's been a good 10 years, I'm thinking, Brad.
At least. Jen,
yeah.
do you know the date, Jen, on that one?
I'm thinking 2015 or 16. I think it was around the time we got the CREP pilot funded for Whitman County, and we just started as being the lead entity, Palouse CD had. So I'm thinking 2015-ish.
Yeah, I think you're right. That'd be my guess. Give or take a year or two on either side. Yep.